thank you for joining us to Passive House Network Presents. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Passive House Network, and I'm really happy to have Monte Paulsen, Passive House Specialist from RDH, with us today to talk about Stepwise EnerPHit, and particularly in the context of the climate emergency that we're finding ourselves in today. I would like to take a few minutes to just briefly introduce the Passive House Network. For those of you who may not be completely familiar, we are a national organization affiliated with the Passive House Institute and the International Passive House Association. We have a series of regionally based chapters and one catch-all, Passive House America, and looking to really build out community, knowledge sharing community across the states and connecting it around the world to our friends in Canada, of course, South America, Europe, and far afield. So that's really the secret of Passive House Power as far as I'm concerned, and encourage you to become a member if you aren't yet, and join in the activities and be an active participant in the community. The other aspect of the Passive House Network is really about education, and it's at the core of what we do. It's how we are going to change the built environment. Education changes how we think and work. It changes our vocabulary. It changes our conversations. And so we've developed a pathway, if you will, of introductory courses, then the core certification courses, advanced specialized courses, and then what we would consider part of your ongoing education is the building certification process. We're happy to have partners along the way with these. Building Energy Exchange in New York in particular around introductory courses. We work with the Passive House Academy and EMU systems in the core certification courses, and a number of folks from Ed May and many others, Peel Passive House, and more around specialized courses. So we're about bringing together people. And the last pitch really is around the North American Certifiers Circle and the education that you can get in certifying your building. It cannot be overstated how much you learn in the process of certification and how much of a better project you can make, and then take that investment to projects going forward. And you have the accumulated knowledge, institutional knowledge of not just the certifier that you're working with, but 12 or 13 other certifiers that are practicing in the United States, as well as certifiers around the world. They are really a huge asset, and encourage everyone to take advantage of them. And I should note, Monty is a building certifier. And certainly his knowledge in that, bringing that to bear in this presentation, I think will show itself for everyone. So on the education front, very briefly, we do have a live online specialized course happening tomorrow for the first time, Passive House Windows. It's a 4-hour sort of deep dive into all the different aspects. And we know Passive House Windows are probably the least, or the most underappreciated, the least understood in terms of their massive impact on building design and performance. Why Passive House is a periodic intro to Passive House that I give, basically a 40-minute presentation and conversation, quite intimate, every couple of weeks. For those who that may be interested in Passive House, have just heard about it, but want to learn more. We are shooting to do an in-person Certified Passive House Designer course in New York City in January. With the new variant, we'll see how that plays out, but for the moment, we are planning on doing it and following all the protocols and the testing and everything that needs to happen. In this environment, we're really excited to keep building out the on-demand offerings that people's schedules. People have never been busier, it seems. People have never had a harder time scheduling things. And with the on-demand format, giving flexibility, accessibility, and really greater affordability, and looking to do that. So with that, I want to have a quick shout out to our sponsors who are critical for what we do here, from all the different key aspects of high performance passive house building, insulation, enclosure performance, windows and doors, and service providers. All these companies are really at the head of the pack in terms of providing high quality building performance. And that's what we like to see and who we like to stand with. So if you have a company that is leaning into high quality and certified components and others, we would love to talk to you about sponsorship. So without further ado, I am very happy to introduce this presentation, and we should have a nice discussion afterwards. Please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to grab them and then feed them into conversation with Monty after his presentation. So look forward to pulling your questions and using them. This is really set in the context of the climate crisis as it exists. Monty's in Vancouver, and we all appreciate the recent climate catastrophes unfolding there rapid fire. And we all appreciate the work ahead, particularly with the existing building stock, and what a monumentous effort we are facing. And EnerPHit as a tool is less well understood, and this is where we want to dive in. So it's my pleasure to introduce Monty. He is among Canada's most experienced passive house professionals. He leads a multi-city passive house team that has consulted on or certified more than 70 projects. So there's some institutional knowledge, totaling 4 million square feet, including homes, offices, affordable mid-rise buildings, and luxury high-rise buildings. He is also a veteran passive house trainer who has helped more than 100 professionals earn their CPHD credential. And his courses range from the introductory to the multi-day workshop, A Pattern Language for Passive House, which is a landmark course. Everyone raves about it. Very important. I am embarrassed to say I have not sat through this course yet, Monty, and we have to write that. I've not been in the same state or city or locale where it's happened. So I'm looking forward to attending it. He's a founding board member, volunteer at the non-for-profit Passive House Canada, national nonprofit, and previously managed his own passive house consulting firm, which merged with RDH in 2016. And my own personal favorite little known fact about Monte Paulsen is, and it may be widely known, but it's not in his bio, is that he was a journalist in a previous Monte Paulsen life. And met Monty many years ago in Seattle, Washington, at a conference, and very much I'm a news nerd, and I'm actually married to a journalist, so it's near and dear to my heart. So with that, without further ado, Monty, take it away.
Thanks. Let's see, I need permission to share the screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. Awesome. Do you all see the slide? Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Ken. It's wonderful. It's great to see so many people here. I am Monte Paulsen. I'm a passive house specialist at RDH Building Science. My colleague Sarah Gray is on the call too, and her email would be sgray@rdh.com, and you feel free to reach out to either one of us. As Ken mentioned, we're up to about 7 million square feet of passive house. We've been doing a lot of work over the last few years, and if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I kind of felt like the work we did on new passive house projects was making a difference around climate. But these last 6 months here in British Columbia have changed my perspective. And I'm really focused on this question of how and why we need to retrofit buildings in a climate emergency. So I'm going to talk just briefly about climate, about what's happened here in the last 6 months and what we've learned from that. The core message here is the central one on this theme, that every building needs a plan. And then we're going to talk about how Stepwise EnerPHit helps you organize a plan if you haven't done this before. If you take nothing else from this hour, there is no new normal. If you hear someone say, oh, this is the new normal, realize they're missing the point. There is no new normal. There is no stable point. This is not anywhere near stable. We are just at the very, very beginning stages of a new geological epoch. The Earth has warmed 1.2 degrees. Land areas have warmed 1.8. That Earth total includes oceans. And Northwest Canada is warming faster than North America. So let's look at what's happened here. It really all started with a little bug for us, and that's how climate things start. The mountain pine beetle started moving in at around 0.6 degrees. We were half what we are now. And all that happened was this bug had always been here, but most of them would die in the winter because it got cold enough. And they'd freeze in the winter, and a few would survive the next year. But as it got just a little bit warmer in winter, the bugs lived through the winter and started killing trees en masse because they just populated and populated and populated. About every region of our forest is affected, and something near half our timber is now dead across the province of British Columbia. And of course, with so much dry timber, we've had these massive wildfires, huge wildfires. Wildfires went from being an emergency to a season, just a regular thing here. And again, that was only about 1 degree. We hadn't really heated up all that much. By 1.2 degrees this year in July, this town of Lytton set heat records for 4 days in a row. Global heat records on the 5th day of the row burned to the ground. And this fall, just a few weeks ago, we started seeing these much wetter atmospheric rivers. Now, we've always had these weather patterns. This is why salmon spawn in the fall, but they were carrying literally twice as much water as they used to be. Why? Because a given volume of air, when the air is hotter up around 20 degrees than down around 10 degrees, which is more normal just a few years ago, can carry twice as much water. And we were setting temperature records because of these up in the 22s, 21s, 22s, huge amounts of water. And so what happened is the water came through the forest that had either been burned by fires or clear cut and created these avalanches everywhere, And so there was this connection between the bugs to the dead forest, to the fire, to the avalanches. And the avalanches were huge. We cut all of our roads to the rest of Canada, more than 20 deep cuts like this. This is our primary highway to the rest of Canada. There are dozens of cuts like this. We won't have our primary highway open until next summer at the very soonest. And it won't be a high-speed road. It'll be little makeshift bridges around all of these pieces. At this point, the only way goods get in and out of Vancouver from Canada is a 1 lane through the mountain road. They run about 1 lane for trucks in one way, 1 lane for trucks in another, and they're still not letting private vehicles on. And then all that water flows downstream, and the Fraser Valley, which is our primary food area for this part of the world, flooded 3 times in 3 weeks, 300-year storms in 3 weeks. More than 6,000 farm animals died that we know of. We're still sorting and counting to figure out what happened. It's billions and billions of damage. And it's funny because the people who live in this region tend to be very conservative. They tend to vote very conservative. This is sort of a middle-class farming community. Many of them don't believe in climate change, but it doesn't matter. They're dealing with it. It doesn't really matter what you believe. The fact is, it's happening to everybody, and it's happening faster and faster and faster. So I want you to just take away this idea of cascade effects, bugs to dead forests, to fires, to rainslides. This is exactly what runaway climate change looks like. It's these cascade effects. It's not one thing. It's the way they add up on each other. And it's really important to start understanding these cascade effects are running faster and faster and faster. One thing is piling on another, and there will be no new normal, not in our lifetimes. And I urge you to think what the cascade effects are where you live. Like, these are the cascade effects where I live, and it's worth knowing these, but the cascade effects are different. And remember, BC is one of the safest places on earth. We have it easy. We are one of the most resilient, long-term safe places anywhere. The vast majority of the rest of the earth, as climate change and the cascade effects happen, would love to have the amount of water that we're dealing with. Roughly 3 billion people will have to migrate by mid-century. So even as I describe this, I'm really aware we have it easy. Second point, things are going to get worse, way worse. We were looking at 1.2 degrees here in BC. We're headed towards 2.6 degrees or more. The amount of heating we're putting in the atmosphere is equivalent, just for the oceans part, of 5 nuclear bombs a second. By the time we finish this event, this 1 hour event, will be the equivalent of 18,000 nuclear bombs of heat have exploded in the ocean just in this hour. That is more than we currently have in nuclear warheads on the planet. And Canadians, Americans are heavily at fault. We have emitted more per capita than most nations. And so when you look at these big global targets, and you've probably seen these, 2030, half emissions by 2030, 2050 net zero, and politicians have really grabbed on this idea of net zero by 2050, realize it's bullshit. 2050 by net zero does not save us at all. It's just been a handy political target. And frankly, only 50% reduction by 2030 doesn't save us either. These targets that are thrown around politically and that you're hearing in the news all the time are nowhere near sufficient. And let's just talk about why for a minute. If we had started reducing back in 2000, we could have reduced emissions at the rate of about 4% a year. But we didn't do that. We added an extra quarter of emissions in the last 20 years. Things went up faster in the last 20 years than they had prior to that, and they're still going up faster. So our situation is far more dire today. The pathway to keeping a 1.5 degree warming world involves the steep, steep gray line you see going down there. And each year for the next few years to 2030, that line gets steeper till the point it'll start to invert. So 2030 is the real tipping point. If we have any hope of keeping a somewhat livable climate, in other words, a climate that's just a bit worse than what we have now, that's 96 months away. 96 months to change the world. Now, some people ask, what about carbon capture and storage? And it's true, there are scientific ways to do it. This is it. This is the only plant on Earth that does it. We have one grand total of one plant. It's a really cool plant. It's in Iceland, run by a great company doing some fantastic engineering. But we could never build enough of these to capture those atomic bombs worth of heat we're letting off every day. So it's definitely a technology worth exploring, but literally one plant that can do the equivalent of 790 cars is not going to save us. And so experts, after the COP meeting a few weeks ago, are now predicting about 2.6 degrees this century, based on what we understand now. That's the most reasonable target of the moment. Really depends on what happens in the next few years. You've seen this graph, where you see carbon dioxide levels and temperature start to shoot up, the so-called hockey stick graph. Just before we get to retrofits, I want you to look at this graph longer term with me. So this is the same graph. Right here on the right is now. We're making these steep rises. This is civilization as we know it, the last 2,000 years or so. Back here in the Pleistocene is when modern human DNA arrived. You could take their DNA and our DNA and match it. It's when language emerged, farming emerged, art, music emerged. Many of the things we think of as civilization happen around this time. And back here in the Pliocene was when early ape-like ancestors, not quite humans, but they started living in groups and using tools in ways that mattered. Note that through all of that time, the temperature was about the same, or a little bit below where we're at now. There has never been a human alive on a 2.6 degree hotter planet, ever. And if you look at that line that's about 2.6 degrees, you'll notice everything before that was before there were any humans. And so if you hear people say, oh, the Earth's been hotter before, yeah, but never when humans lived here. We have no idea how to live in this environment. The entire time it was like that, there was nothing remotely like us as mammals on the planet. So the real question is, as we go through this, as we approach 2.6 degrees, or perhaps worse, go past, how are we going to live? How are we going to survive? How are we going to make it? And that's why every building needs a plan. We actually need to think of buildings as survival shelters for an incredibly more dangerous world. And there's two concepts to take away. Most of you have probably seen it, but adaptations. Buildings need to shelter people on a 2.6 degree or greater planet, and mitigation. Building means to emit nothing, nothing to preserve a 2.6 degree planet. Our premiers, like our governor here in British Columbia, said, oh, when these floods happen, this is a guy, nice guy, I like John. These are extraordinary events, not measured, not contemplated. The problem was his own government issued a report in 2019 that contemplated and warned about these exact cascade effects. They said, what happened, the cascade thing, is exactly what they're told us would happen. And they warned us specifically about wildfires and smoke, extreme storms, overland flooding, sea level rise, and overheating. Exactly what we've seen has been warned about. And again, I'd urge you to study and figure out what the cascade effects are in your region. And here's the thing, architects and engineers are legally responsible. We can get sued. We've been warned by the government. Our own engineering associations have said climate change imposes a new and evolving pressure on the standard of care. Specifically this year, there's a climate change action plan by engineers here in British Columbia that says, look, registrants are expected to consider the impact of their work on the climate. So here's the point I'm trying to make here. Politicians in both countries can pretend they didn't know. Oh, what happened? Oh, didn't know that was coming. We can't. We are legally responsible, those of us who work in buildings, and we need to consider our legal liability as well as the survivability of our buildings. So let's talk about that directly. In that town of Lytton, when it burned, those same few days, we call it the heat dome of 2020. We had a record high, about 49.6 C. I think that's in the range of 120 F. I'm sorry, I can't do the number conversions in my head. More importantly, our lows didn't go very low. So as the lows stayed high, our buildings didn't cool off at night, and they just built heat for 2 or 3 days. There were approximately 600 people who died from heat-related causes. That's like coroner determined this was a heat-related death during that time. The vast majority of those, more than 90%, were seniors, and 99% of them died in their own homes, the rest in like hotels or police stations or things like that. So people were dying at home during this heat wave. The possibility for legal liability going in the future of, as we build buildings, people literally go home to seek shelter and die, is very real. And what we know is that there are at least 6 factors that affect overheating, and we tend not to look at them. It's about solar gains, of course. We talk about that a lot at Passhouse, but the temperature outside matters. And we need to model everything for 2050 and 2080 climates. The urban heat island effect is very real. We tend to build multi-unit housing in places that have more urban heat island effect. As we do smaller units, the occupant density creates more internal heat gains per square foot or per square meter of building. We have more and more losses from these aggressive domestic hot water systems and other mechanical systems. And we have these huge lifestyle variations. Some people have these huge gaming machines in their apartments that put out 1,000 watts per permanent real time, completely changing the energy balance of those buildings. We need to be looking at all of these factors. Another piece of adaptation, of course, is wildfire smoke. We've seen it all across the continent. On the left, there is a typical Zender HRV. The one on the left came out after about 2 days of wildfire smoke. The one on the right is a typical dirty filter, the inside filter that came out as the air is coming into the unit. The good news is all of that black good you see on the outside did not end up in the lungs of the occupants of that residency. And we're really going to have to look at how to use filters and use ventilation to preserve indoor air quality as outdoor air becomes worse and worse and worse. And of course, sea level rise. This is what it means to my area, Vancouver. Huge storm surges in a few more years, 1 meter rise. But frankly, places like Boston and New York are looking at far worse sea level rise scenarios. And it's going to change all of our thinking about where we build and what we build. Parts of our cities are going to have to be abandoned, and we're going to have to build new places and other spots. And then we're starting to see governments react. And we're a little bit fortunate here in BC, and that our government is reacting a little bit more proactively, not enough still. And so we have this Clean BC plan that by 2030, any heating device of less than 100% efficiency, which means boilers and furnaces, will not be legal. You won't be able to buy one, new or used, after that point. And so every building is going to have at least electric assistance, if not some form of heat pump, by 2030. And that's changing the thinking of real estate operators. Do I want to quickly upgrade to a great boiler right before 2030? Or do I want to get on the bandwagon and get heat pumps? And for those that are thinking about the boiler, it's the same thing for large buildings. It's just an example of a larger gas boiler and larger CO2 heat pumps. For those that are thinking about the quick, the other factor is the carbon tax. Our carbon tax is making gas, fossil gas, taxed up to $9 a gigajoule by 2030. For a typical Canadian house, that's about $800 a year in extra gas tax on top of whatever the gas rate is, on top of everything else. Or from the point of a investment landlord, somebody owning an apartment building, that's $9 a gigajoule that could go to improving the building, putting on enclosure retrofit, electrifying heat pumps. That's an annual cost that can be amortized into repairs. And then here in BC and across Canada, we're about to launch a whole bunch of new grant programs for homeowners as well as for larger buildings. We need to be worried, though, that the last program didn't work out so well. In the last program, we had a lot of furnace installations of low quality that didn't actually result in great savings. We had lots of windows that were double pane, often poorly installed. And those were most of what the grant funded. A lot of the other parts of the program didn't get much uptake. So as we work with building owners now, you have these climate impacts, you have cost, you have the sphere of locking in low performance, you have the carbon tax. Put yourself for a moment in the shoes of a building owner next year. You have these continuous cascading disasters. At the very least, it's going to affect your insurance costs, if not actually wiping out part of your building or causing you to rethink your portfolio and maybe sell some properties and invest in others. You also have continual escalating costs. Our construction costs have been going crazy, and it's just more so now that our supply chain is largely interrupted. You have continually changing code requirements, different steps being introduced every year between now and 2030 moving forward. You have continually changing building technology. One of the great things about the Passhouse communities, we're always talking about new systems of panelization and new heat pumps and new ventilation systems. But to us, these things are kind of exciting. To building operators, it's just overwhelming. Oh my God, what about this new thing? You also have massive demand for new housing. And what housing is worth is spiraling upward radically, which does create capital, but also challenges. The bans on gas connections or gas appliances, and they work differently by different state and province, but the pattern of more restrictions on new gas is fairly consistent. You have these new retrofit demands: smoke, heat, indoor air quality. And at least here in Canada, you have this Canadian carbon tax that you can calculate into your expenses going forward. It's mind-blowing. How is an owner who also has to, like, rent the suite and pay the mortgage and take care of all the normal business that's a full-time job for building owners and operators, they have to consider all this new stuff, and they're realizing they have to consider it really, really quickly. They don't have a 20-year, 30-year window to think about this. So every building on Earth, somewhere in the vicinity of 5 billion buildings, needs a climate retrofit plan. And of course, it's unique for every building, but the key message here is we all need a plan. These plans need to consider flooding scenarios. Does it not apply to this building? Are you going to lift the building? Are you going to sell the property? And realize a lot of the people in the interior in BC thought they were free from flooding because they're far from the ocean, but didn't realize that all the upstream fires and clear cuts put them right in the path of landslides. We need to model every building for current and future climate to look at all 6 factors of overheating, and then be thinking about how is this building going to adapt over time? What systems are there? What needs to be renewed? Do buildings need shading? Do they need cooling? We need to measure indoor air quality and outdoor air quality, and then retrofit ventilation and filtration on every single building. We need to talk about mitigation. How do we get to zero emissions? Not net zero, but zero emissions in buildings by 2030. We need to consider the impact of future codes that are changing quickly, and it's hard to juggle and keep track of everything. We need to consider impact of things like the carbon tax in Canada, and I hope someday soon you'll have a carbon tax in the US or some other cap and trade system that actually has teeth. And how much capital available is when is available. This is what a climate retrofit plan needs to consider at the minimum, plus the needs of the building, local zoning, local pieces. We've been doing these kind of plans at RDH and other firms for several years. The Lord Harley Apartments in Victoria is one where we did this kind of a retrofit. It wasn't quite to EnerPHit level, but we saw these major pieces. And we are getting calls more and more from major landowners such as Minto in Ontario to assess their portfolios, to look at their buildings and say, great, what do we want to retrofit, in what order? What's the standards we're going to retrofit these things to? And frankly, we have kind of spreadsheets and systems. We work through that stuff. But we can't do 6 billion buildings. We need everybody engaged in this. We need everybody to kind of invent their own system right now. So I urge you to take a look at EnerPHit. And I want to just talk for a few minutes about what it looks like. It's a tool for helping building owners plan for mitigation and adaptation. Let's not even focus right now on whether or not you hit the pass target. Use the tool to plan for these circumstances. So more than 5,000 buildings have been upgraded using the EnerPHit approach. One of the great tranches of buildings is a project called Sinfonia, with quite a few projects in Austria. I urge you to Google that and look at them. This was one of these buildings before, and this is one of these after. Notice they actually cut off the balconies to minimize the thermal bridging, put them out on little supports. If you Google Sinfonia, there's several presentations. I think there's been some on PassFast Network, but certainly on PassFast Accelerator and at some of the conferences. They are great prototypes for larger buildings doing these, and they've learned lots of lessons about how to retrofit buildings with people in place. Overall, the way Stepwise EnerPHit works is you start with the original building. You then sit down with the team and you develop a plan. You go through all those pieces we just talked about and say, what's this? And you figure out where the building needs to end. What's the end point building that's going to have everything we need by 2030 or 2040? And that's your overall plan. And you would typically run that plan then and break it down into steps, either because of government incentives or because of electrification requirements or because of cash flow or whatever, or need some critical thing in the building and say, okay, for this building, we're going to do cladding first. For that building, we're going to do electrification first. For this other building, we're going to do these steps in this order. It won't be the same for every building, but there is a logical steps of doing things that allows the capital to flow in more slowly, and the disruption to tenants to be a little more managed over time. You work that plan out and you send it to a certifier, and the certifier says, yep, if you follow that plan, at the end, I will certify this building as an EnerPHit certified building. And then you proceed through the steps, and you can put a plaque on the building at around 25% improvement, and you can keep going. And even if it takes 10, 15, 20 years to get to that final stage, you make sure you don't lock yourself into corners. You've created a master plan you're working towards and logical steps to get there, and you proceed through those steps as makes sense. It might start with a design pH model of some energy inputs. This is a design pH model of the community center we're working on. It allows us to really quickly see where the energy losses are. That would get rolled into a PHPP model. And there's basically two paths to EnerPHit certification. One we call the component method, where you look at your climate. If you were in a cool temperate climate, you simply make sure all your walls and windows hit or achieve this level of efficiency. That's the kind of climate region for PHI. And if all the components meet there, and you meet your air tightness and a few other requirements, even if your modeling is not perfect, you can still achieve EnerPHit certification. The component method has worked really well these last few years in Europe because there are many, many, many pass-pass components on the marketplace. And as the component supply improves through the new construction projects, it's more increasingly feasible in North America as well. The other method is the energy demand method. You model it just the same way you would a new building. And of course, in new buildings in pass-pass, we're trying to achieve 15 kilowatt hours per square meter of heat loss, or 4.75 BTU per hour per square foot. Is that right? Per foot per hour. In a cool temperate climate, the EnerPHit targets 25. It can be a little lower in warmer climates and a little higher in colder climates. And you simply use PHPP as you would for any building and model to that. Both methods also require air tightness and a PER demand limit. So once you have your endpoint PHPP, you use the variant functions in PHPP, and I'm sure Pass-Pass Network has PHPP training. We ought to have training just on variants, frankly, how to use variants really well. Ed May would be the perfect person to lead that, I might add. But variants is a tool where you can create multiple versions of PHPP without having to have multiple files, and you can change a few things. And you use the variants tool to lay out the steps that you developed in concert with the owners and operators of the building. And you say, great, first we're going to do in this model heat recovery, ventilation, and windows, and then we're going to do ceiling and roof and PV, and then we're going to do the exterior walls, and last it looks like there's a heat pump add here. And you can see how it gets down to its target over those variants. And you actually do the detailed work in PHPP. Every step is there, and you might go back and forward. And then you pull that out of PHPP into a sister program, which is just another Excel file. PHPP is Excel if you haven't used it. It's another Excel file, and it pulls the variant piece out, and you can start elaborating on it and work into a plan. And you're kind of translating the energy model into layperson speak for anyone else to read, breaking down the steps, and you might tweak them a little bit. You would look at the maintenance costs and the investment costs for these. And I think that's another great thing the Pass-Pass regional networks could do, Ken, is kind of develop by region. Here's what our energy costs are. Here's what our approximate costs are for these kind of things as standard inputs, because people shouldn't spend a lot of time trying to guess this. It's meant to give you a kind of ballpark look. But this gives you an ability to work with the owner and understand the cost implications, both at the front end, but also what am I going to save? When am I going to start avoiding the carbon tax? When am I going to have a boiler in before I can't get a new boiler, And then that flows into a scheduler document. Again, it's part of this template that runs alongside PHPP on your desktop. And you start to move things forwards or backwards a little bit. So here's some maintenance things, here's repairs, here's replacements. You can start to see if there's any impacts for one thing or the other. There might be local supply issues or a sale on something, that just causes you to move something up or down. The schedule is a live Gantt chart like any project, but it stretches over, 10, 15 years into the future. All of this gets rolled up into an EnerPHit retrofit plan that shows this stuff, that's a template that explains these pieces. And it's the PHPP plus that plan that gets approved by a certifier that said, yeah, that makes sense to us, and you can modify it over time, but they're agreeing, yeah, if you do this, I will essentially pre-certify it. I will say, yeah, if you do this, we'll certify the thing at the end. Look, this notion of a template of a form is the same thing companies like RDH who do lots of deep energy retrofits use. We have our own tools for this kind of thing, but EnerPHit is free. You can just download it and start it on your own project now. So again, you've got the old building, you develop a plan, work it over, you break it down into steps, you kind of analyze those steps for the cost effectiveness and the timing effectiveness. You take that package to a Pass-Pass certifier who kind of might give you some feedback and advice, and then off you go. When you do 25% of it, you can put a plaque saying EnerPHit in progress. And then when you complete it, you have a final EnerPHit house. And you have this confidence, or a large building or apartment building or whatever it is, you have this confidence that you're really there. You're not going to have another retrofit. I mean, one of the things that could happen right now in BC is if a building retrofits to meet some of the targets that are coming out in the next couple of years from the province, they might have to retrofit again after 2030 to meet other targets that are still emerging. Whereas when you go to a standard like Pass-Pass or EnerPHit, you're there. There's not going to be any need to go a second time or go further. You can kind of rest assured that that building is functional, durable, resilient, fairly well adapted. And of course, EnerPHit doesn't require some of the adaptation targets. We're adding those because of our perspective now, but it gives you a format to organize the adaptation and mitigation targets really clearly. So just to summarize a few key features, and then we'll show a couple project examples, and then we're out of here. The PHPP model is compared in concert with the building owner. You would hire a CPHD or a CPHC to work with it, but they don't go work in isolation. They kind of bring the final outcome and then come back. This avoids that lock-in of low performance, as has happened with previous grant programs in Canada, and I imagine elsewhere too. And of course, it addresses issues like domestic hot water, cooling, efficient appliances, comfort. All of those things have a metric that you're being held to, not only now, but with future climate files as well. The cost estimates and savings are built into the process. You actually have to run those calculations as part of it. And there's even a possibility, and you'd have to talk to your certifier and your project on this, it's not a blanket offer, but if there's something like that's historic, let's say you have historic windows in the front of the building, and you really can't change those windows because they have historic value and they're plaqued in some way, you can make a case that it's too expensive to do that one feature. And so that feature will somehow be held out and some of those heat losses locked out, and you might get a little bit of overage for your plan. But again, you have to do the economic analysis to kind of show where something is just ridiculously too expensive. And you bring that to your certifier with your plan and say, okay, we're not doing this one part for this very clear reason. Not just any reason, but you can do it. And again, it's meant to be a flexible process. The retrofits are typically broken into 3 or more steps in concert with contractors, homeowners, and the steps could be based on future code, adaptation requirements, mitigation requirements, government programs, funding options, or just plain preference. I want to do my cladding last. Detailed plan is prepared, building certifier approves it, and at 25%, you can get initial plaque. The first EnerPHit we did here in the Vancouver area was this little house in North Vancouver, pretty typical, like 60s, 70s, mid-century house, 2x4 walls, tiny little garage. You can see they expanded the garage in the process. There's a small paper on it you can download from the Passive House Canada website and others. I'm going to show you where you can get some more of this information later, but it was a really typical suburban house. It was early in this cycle of 2017. There were still early supply chain issues here, so they had less choices than they would have now, but relatively easy to do for a contractor without a lot of past house experience. The largest project currently underway in Canada that's almost finished is the Sobel Tower in Hamilton, Ontario. There are a bunch of presentations by ERA architects that I urge you to watch. You can probably find them on Passive House Network and Passive House Excel or other places. If you Google around, there's several presentations about this building, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. But note that this was the classic thing. In 1967, it was a super happy family place. At the very early golden days of social housing. It had a lot of wear, particularly the balconies had a lot of wear. The balconies were not retainable. There had been so much spalling right where they connect, and this happens on a lot of balconies in cold climates, that they were either going to be upgraded or removed. And this is probably the biggest issue for retrofitting taller buildings, is what to do with balconies. There's only 3 choices. You can saw them off, you can wrap them with foam, or you can enclose them and bring them inside. And there's pros and cons to each step. On the Hamilton building, they were all sawn off. New fiberglass triple pane windows were put in, new exterior insulation was put on, and the building is nearing completion now. Urge you to Google it, Sobel Tower, ERA architects. And the next really high-flying one is this building, the Pirelli building in New Haven. Steve Winter Associates are doing a complete retrofit of this historic modernist building that will become a net zero hotel going forward. I think that's one to watch. Stephen Winter is a fantastic firm that'll have some great presentations on this going forward, but it shows that it's possible to do in even a brutalist building where you're trying to keep some of those features. For more about EnerPHit, these 2 links, the first one is at PHI, and there's several resources about EnerPHit and examples and pamphlets. The second one is the Passive House database, and it's here. If you haven't been there, go to Energy Standard Building Type. See right there where it's circled? And just put in EnerPHit retrofit, and you'll get about 160 buildings that are in the database, and you can look building by building at what they've done. And if you have questions, it typically lists the CPHD or CPHC or architect of the project, and quite often you can just email them and say, hey, I really have this question. Keep it short, but you'll be surprised at how giving people are within this community. So if you want to see examples, look at the database. You don't have to look at EnerPHit. You can look at other passive houses too. And I'll tell you, as a consultant, when I get given a new building type, like all of a sudden they want us to do an art gallery, the first thing I do is go look at other galleries and museums, here to see what's been done elsewhere. RDH has published some guides for retrofits. There's quite a few others. I really like the Passive House Accelerator overview that came out last year, but a lot of good guides out there, a lot of good research. Which brings me to where I want to leave this, at least before some questions. It's hard. It's been hard for 6 months. It's hard watching your province in 6 months go from, setting peak heat records to flooding 3 times in 3 weeks. It's hard watching politicians, even politicians you really like and respect, kind of lie and obfuscate through these issues. And it's hard to keep hope alive during this time. I keep thinking back to 1983. There was a time in the States where, since the death of Martin Luther King, a lot of African Americans were feeling like the government had abandoned them, that they were slipping backwards economically and in many ways. And in the peak of the Reagan years, it seemed really stark. It's funny, in hindsight, it seems kind of fairy tale-ish, but it seemed really stark at the time. And Jesse Jackson ran for president with this phrase, keep hope alive. And he was referencing all of that hope that had built up over decades and decades and decades of African Americans and others in the United States. And just kind of, he never became president. I don't think he ever intended to, but he intended to help people understand where you find hope, where you find it in yourselves, and this importance of keep hope alive. It was his catchphrase through his campaigns. It was the title of a great speech he gave at a Democratic convention. In the current situation, what I define as despair is that Americans and Canadians use an average of 16 tons of greenhouse gases per person. That's about what we're using, and it's still going up. The hope is when we get to about 2 tons. Globally, if our current population all uses about 2 tons a year, we can meet that 2030 requirement. And while we need to work collectively and we need to work through governments, there is a lot we can do individually. The first thing is just set a personal target. Look at your own life, do your own math, even if it's just on the back of a napkin, and set some targets. There's a fun book by Lloyd Alter, who also writes a lot about passive house for tree hugger, called Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle, where for a year, he tried to live in that 2-ish ton range to see what that would be like and what we'd have to do. He does a lot of the math for you. So if you're looking for a guide to figure that out, it's a great book for that. It's not a huge read. So write a climate plan for your own home, even if you don't own a home, even if you live in an apartment. I live in a rental building, and I'm talking to my good old boy landlord about, these same issues. And he's concerned about adaptation. He's concerned about these issues, even if he's not a born passive house aficionado. Get an e-bike, just drive less. I don't even say never drive, just drive less. Find out how much less you can drive. Push yourself to see how you can do it. And I'll tell you, e-bikes are really fun. Fly less. Flying's a 1/4 ton an hour. If you're trying to hit 2 tons a year, 2 4-hour flights, you're done, right? So you can't be flying every month and hit the 2-ton lifestyle. So just really rethinking, how much do I fly? Again, we're not saying never. We're saying, like, 1 good trip a year, maybe. Eat less meat makes a difference. A big difference, huge amount comes through diet. Lots of folks have written about that. Buy less of everything makes a big difference. Less shipping. We're really, the blessing of this current climate emergency is that our stores are bare. We're not getting things the way we usually get them, and we're rethinking what we really need. And talk about it. Don't do this alone. Don't be alone. Don't be suffering in silence during a pandemic. Remember, this is not like the pandemic. The pandemic will end. At some point, everyone will be vaccinated or dead, and we'll be through this. Climate doesn't end. It will continue for our whole lifetimes, and so we need each other. We need each other to lean on each other and support political action and fossil fuels wherever we can. So, thanks for listening. I tried to push through this quickly so we'd have some time for questions and answers here. My email is there, mpaulsen@rdh. You're welcome questions. And I know my colleague Sarah Gray in our Toronto office here, which would be sgray@rdh.com if you have others. And let's take whatever questions you have now, Ken.
Yeah, well, there aren't any in the chat that I can see at the moment, except wanting to get this presentation. But I have questions, and I think we could have a good discussion here. I think it is one of these things we all struggle with, seeing the climate emergency coming at us at 100 miles an hour, and the pace of construction being painfully slow, and seeing passive house as a mitigation and adaptation measure simultaneously. I'm really curious to dive in a little bit first off on EnerPHit and retrofitting, and we get going towards passive house and avoiding lock-in. I think one of the things we're talking about in terms of buying less and whatnot is not just avoiding lock-in where we have to retrofit, but just doing things out of sequence where we have to undo work and do work again. And then as we see in replacement and repair costs in embodied carbon calculations for buildings, they can keep creating a mountain in front of you that your operational efficiency needs to keep digging you out of. And I'm curious in your work at RDH and your experience otherwise, and you're looking at these projects. I know the Ken Sobel project is a fabulous one, a real trailblazer, one we do have on our website from the conference earlier this year. And the house and others, they were not step-by-step retrofits, right? They're all in one.
Yeah.
I believe there is a step-by-step underway in Hamilton on one of the high rises.
In Windsor, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Windsor high rise.
Right. That's right. And I'm wondering your experience in the projects that you're looking at, like how are you seeing building owners with this, if they're want to take it on and are serious about it, how are they thinking about just doing it all at once versus actually the step-by-step approach and what factors they're playing with? And particularly, I don't know, it's fascinating. I love that you brought up portfolio owners. You know, with so much of this, it's going to be the corporations or organizations that own hundreds of buildings or dozens of buildings or whatever it might be. We see it with the public housing in Toronto, which owns just a mind-boggling number of buildings.
And New York.
New York City, absolutely.
Yeah.
So speak broadly or specifically to some of that. And
I think obviously every building owner is unique, but I think many owners are definitely feeling overwhelmed right now. They see, that graph I tried to put together, and if anybody has ways to illustrate that better, please let me know, send me a note. But I think they're feeling like they've got complaints from owners about certain things, it's not hot enough, it's too hot. They've got critical moments during the year where they can tell they're overheated and they realize it's a real problem and they're kind of hoping we won't have another heat dome next year, but they know one will come sooner or later. They are vaguely aware of changing codes, but not as aware as those of us who work in it every day. They are aware that the carbon tax is going to change their payment schedules. They know how much gigajoules gas they use, so they can do that pretty quickly, probably in their heads, and figure out, wow, that's a lot of money to us, especially as rental building owners. It could be thousands of dollars, many thousands of dollars a year. I think more than deciding whether it's one step or multi-steps, they kind of want an end game. They're kind of exhausted of continual changes. Another thing happens and another thing happens and another thing happens. I think they really want to know, what does it all need to be? And they would like a certification program that gives them the option of stepwise or the option of doing it all at once. And EnerPHit does that. And I think for many portfolio owners, so I think for every building, even homeowners, just want, where's the end game? Where do I get there? What do I need to do? What are all the steps? I want to see everything on the playbook here. And then I can work backwards with my own budget and my own desires. I think for bigger portfolio owners, it's a little more complicated, I think. And they're asking us to look at their whole portfolio. And I believe it'll go through a kind of triage process, when we prepare some of this analysis, where they might say, okay, these buildings are really subject to mudslides. I think we'll just effing sell them. We're not going to upgrade them. We're going to let that be someone else's problem. And then these buildings have huge upgrade potential. Like they're at the end of their service lives. It's time. They're performing poorly. So the upgrades are slam dunks on these ones. Maybe those ones will just do all out. We'll just go and have them done quickly because it's really there. And then there's probably this other group of buildings that maybe we have done some retrofits on recently. Maybe we've reclad them. We don't want to give up the value of what we just did, even though it's not at this depth. So maybe those buildings might pursue a more stepwise plan where, we do this in 10 years, this in 20 years, this in the other years. And so I think most portfolio owners want an analysis like that. They want one company that can come in and do it. They don't want to engage with 50 consultants and then 150 vendors to figure it out. And so they're really interested in, rather than a conventional contracting situation, more like a construction manager, someone who just line up everybody for them and run it through.
Right.
But
Good point.
I also think we're seeing a shift where many of our federal programs and grant programs are focused on homeowners. I think more and more are focused on rental owners, and rental owners who plan to hold the buildings in a portfolio probably can afford this. They have the capital and they can amortize the payments, and they can see what's worth it to them and what's not worth it to them. They can do that math by themselves. They do it every day. I think the real problem is going to be stratas or condo associations. They don't have the money. They don't have the long-term incentive.
Right. There's a huge gap.
There's a huge gap. And I think that's, it's for poorer households, and condo associations are going to be where our government programs really need to step in much larger. And some commercial buildings, marginal commercial buildings.
Yeah, they don't have to raise the floor, right, and fill a much bigger gap in the middle.
Sorry, just one more point, but like, we've really become aware here that things are going to change. So in the Fraser Valley, an awful lot of those farmers and farmhands lived in old, beat up houses, 100-year-old wooden houses. They were cute. They liked them. They liked their old house. They weren't very efficient. They were totally underinsured in most cases too. They will replace the replacement value of an old 100-year-old wood house, but you can't build that new house for $80,000. Like, there's just no way. So I think things like the flooding are going to exacerbate the rich and poor problem. Some will hang on to their land and put a trailer where there used to be a cute little farmhouse, and they'll manage to stay. And the trailer will never be emotionally what the cute little farmhouse was to them as a family, and they'll have to live with that. Others won't be able to rebuild at all. And so they'll end up selling their land. And, unfortunately, the pattern has been when land sells, it sells to rich people who want to build a mansion in a field, and they'll call it a farm because they harvest blueberries every few years or something. But, and so you're going to see more of those people, and they probably don't see this today, but they're going to wind up living in multifamily housing in town because they can't afford this rural lifestyle that was what they really pursued. And there's a lot of grief and agony that will come with a lot of that, and a lot of mental health issues. But we're not going to see the world look the way it looks now. And as we think about retrofits, we need to keep that firmly in mind. We're not going to retrofit every building. A whole bunch are going to be wiped away by climate faster than we get. We think the number is something like 3,000 or 4,000 buildings through these floods. We don't actually have an exact count yet.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine just to fathom the migration issues that we're dealing with, both within the countries and externally. Or within regions. It's going to be everywhere. It's not. So to flip briefly to the other side of the equation, as a professional, as an architect and engineer looking at these buildings, where you're seeing, it's very specific costs being put in. It's part of a longer term plan, sure, but you're dealing often where you're not going to see that result down the road. Who even knows who's going to own the building? Down the road, you're going to sell the building with this plan, right?
Yeah.
What's the bankability of all of that? There are a lot of variables, right? So I guess to just bring it back to the real conversation that I think a lot of people have is where you're just trying to justify the cost of the windows going in and not lock in with crappy windows and say, hey, this building deserves these windows. You need these windows and the ventilation system and on and on. And I don't know, in your thinking about finessing the conversation in the order of bringing up things, I'm not expecting you to pull a rabbit out of a hat, but any insights in terms of how you come at those conversations?
Yeah, it's important to get clear objectives, in that first is finding the plan, so we're in a project right now. We had some dust ups in the last 2 weeks where the owner and the people paying for the project had not envisioned adding cooling, but it's clear it's a seniors building and it already is overheating, and with additional insulation and better windows, it's definitely going to need cooling. And that was not in their plan. And they're angry because it's like, here's this climate thing that's thrown something on here that they don't want to do it. But especially given that, we had this real painful event this year, everyone's focused on, especially seniors buildings need cooling. So it's not in their plan. It's not in their budget. They feel like, I watch my clients go through the Kubler-Ross, anger, bargaining, grief, denial, acceptance, or something like that. I probably got that wrong. But I watch them go through that process. Like, yep, here comes the anger. They didn't want to hear this. So I think there is a healthy discussion process of agreeing what the goals are. And then once the goals are clear, this is our performance for cooling. Here's how we're going to model it. This is our line. This is our performance for indoor air quality. Here's what we're going to model. And this is our performance for overall heat loss, the conventional targets for.
It sounds to me like it's just sort of a bit more aggressive posturing to the typical construction conversation. Where people are getting a lot of news that they don't necessarily want to hear, unless they're super sophisticated clients, which we don't get enough of sometimes. And working through that aggressively and not thinking it's going to happen, that people are just going to make the right choices.
Yes, totally. But and this is what I'm trying to demonstrate in this presentation, and we will share the PDF, and I just made it. And steal these ideas, please. Like, if they think Passive House or EnerPHit is the top of the hill, and that's why they're doing this, it's easy to let go of because it's just a freaking plaque.
Right.
But when they realize they have to do this to survive, the building has to keep people alive in a climate that is 1.5, 1.7, 2, 2.5 degrees above normal. The building is what keeps people alive. It's a tremendously valuable asset on many levels. And so we find when we can get clients focused on mitigation adaptation with reasonable targets, then you're having the conversations that matter. And the EnerPHit plan is only a piece of that. It's a tool to help you get there. It's not the hilltop you're trying to get to. It's surviving this century is the hilltop.
Right. Great point. And it changes the whole frame.
Yeah.
So two related questions. In terms of sequence and preference that you've seen in projects to date, to the extent that there is a sequence, do you see a pattern there? And specifically in terms of roofs, what, it's the one thing that's relatively exposed, fewer penetrations perhaps, and you can get to it. Have you seen a preference to go for that? And what would you do given the blank slate?
Yeah, it's so situational, and it's Sarah, I see her on the call. If you want to leap in with something here, please do, because Sarah has had more experience in Toronto office than we've had in the Vancouver office a little bit. I guess I would say it's situational in that, there's certainly places where on houses and others, metal roofs are tremendously more resilient to fire. They just don't light on fire. So there's a preference for metal roofs in a lot of situations. For larger buildings, it really depends on how you want to use that roof. Do you want to just put solar up there or just defend, or do you want to use it as a patio? Do you see a sequence preference, Sarah? We're on mute.
Sorry.
I don't like to say a one size fits all because, as you said earlier, Monty, it's about what do we have and what's the plan. If I have a roof that's got a half decent insulation on it and it's only 5 years old, I don't want to throw out the embodied carbon on that relatively new roof. So it's looking back again at that holistic plan. What do we have and what are the trigger points that will start that stepwise EnerPHit plan or any retrofit plan? Yeah, we want is, a high levels of insulation, highly airtight. Are we putting PV panels on the roof? They're going to have big structural framing members that penetrate all of that insulation. Of course, we don't want any of that in terms of the thermal bridging, but, I just don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want great enclosure at the end. If the end is 2030 or 2040 or 2050, how are we going to get there? And that's the message that you conveyed today, Monty. So I don't want to give a one size fits all answer. It's about getting to great, and where and how and when we get to great is what's customized for every building.
Great, thank you. I wanted to speak to I wanted to make the quick point that it's one of the reasons what you're speaking to, Sarah, in terms of replacement and the cost of that and the embodied carbon that's there. And a quick plug that Passive House Network has been working with the AECB in the UK, Tim Martell and others, EC3, and to release a pH ribbon that will have the embodied carbon calculation in the PHPP. So you can look at these step by step and look at the replacement, the associated embodied carbon costs, and really see that play out, not just financially, but in terms of the carbon emissions. So stay tuned. And then maybe as closing out here, there's a question regarding, these concepts. We have zero energy and net zero energy. Now we're talking about zero carbon and net zero carbon. And I think I really appreciated your strong point at the beginning of COP and other places getting really run off the rails around the concept of net zero. And in my opinion, it would be best to leave it in the dustbin. But could you speak a little bit about this in terms of carbon net zero?
So, yeah, all these concepts make it too complicated. Let's make it easy. Don't burn stuff in buildings. Any stuff. Just don't burn stuff. Like, just get rid of all the burning stuff. And that's where you're headed. And if you need to do that in phases because of other reasons, then fine, you need to do that in phases. But the goal is not to burn to burn as little in society generally, and definitely not to burn anything at all in buildings. For embodied, and so that's when we say zero emissions, obviously buildings always have emissions. There'll be garbage flowing through buildings forever, right? So, but when we say zero emissions, we mean no burning of fossil fuels and no release of refrigerants from the building. Now, for embodied carbon, nothing beats renovation. Renovating a large wood frame building or a concrete frame building or a steel frame building makes more sense than tearing it down and building a new one. And so I think that the biggest piece here is renovate every building we can possibly renovate. The only exceptions would be where cities are growing from the single family house placeholder neighborhoods to mature neighborhoods of mid-rise residential. Go the whole step. Don't look like just, I think the missing middle conversation is outdated, frankly, given the climate emergency. We can't do these little infill, like go straight to 6-story wood frame buildings or 4-story, whatever makes sense, in your context. So I think zoning and going as aggressively as we can and retrofitting everything. There should be requirements to retrofit. Knocking down a concrete frame is insane in this point in time.
Right. I think to speak to your point, in one of your slides, you were talking about what you could do personally is buy less. One thing that's hard for the construction industry to hear is build less, right? Yeah. And EnerPHit is a really smart way to build less.
Look, I didn't include it in this, although we've been looking at it. Like, climate change is the biggest construction boom in human history. The construction doesn't have to worry about building less. We will be rebuilding things so fast, so much. And what we're seeing here is that, before we've even finished talking about Lytton, now we have a much larger community down the road that is flooded. And before we finish that one, there'll be another one and another one. And so the question is, what communities can we afford to rebuild and what just don't have enough assets and get left behind? Right. But the question is not, can we keep the construction industry going? The construction tractor in the province right now is trying to rebuild roads. They've taken them off construction projects and sent them up to try to put roads back together. So there's no shortage of construction work. The question is, what do we want to build differently as we come back, and what can we afford to do?
Right, the character of it is critical.
Well, and we had a few weeks ago, we had 3 highways connecting us to the rest of Canada. Do we really need 3? Do we need to maybe invest in one that's much more proof, and the other one could become a rail corridor or something? Like, there's lots of discussions that have become interesting.
Yeah, terrific. It's a huge topic. Retrofits is something that everybody goes back to. Everyone wants to know more about. And as we get more experience, share those experiences so we can all learn from each other. And what you're doing at RDH and within the realm of certification is critical, trailblazing. And so thank you for your time today, Monty.
Thank you. And to everybody, I just find your own ways of hope. Don't let the depressing nature of this paralyze you. Like, you have to go through the grief, you have to accept the losses, and so that you can get on with keep hoping alive for yourself and others, Yeah.
Personally, it's a daily cycle. Yeah. Right.
Like these last few weeks have been hard for a lot of us. Like, every day it's like, what new part of the province washed away overnight, Yeah. And many of us almost all of us have some friend or acquaintance who's lost their home or, experiencing real loss or sleeping on somebody's sofa till they figure things out. And we've got it easy compared to so much of the world. Like, we're relatively affluent. It's going to change a lot. So keep hope alive. Every building needs a plan. Talk about it.
Absolutely. Share, share, share. All right. Thank you, Monty. Sarah.
Thank you all.
everybody
So
for
great to
joining
see
us.
so many of you here today.
Absolutely. Have a great day. Bye-bye.